American officials believe that Russia is secretly trying to deploy its nuclear weapons in space, a statement that has put Washington in a terrible deadlock and can become the basis for a full-scale war. Russia's nuclear sword of Damocles over America/nuclear Armageddon is coming? When Mike Turner, chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, issued a cryptic warning about Russia's covert military capabilities, calling it a serious threat to national security, he fueled concern in the United States. Concerns about Turner's comments were heightened when White House spokesman John Kirby confirmed that Moscow was developing an anti-satellite weapon. Several news outlets, such as the New York Times, have since reported that Moscow may be preparing to deploy a nuclear weapon in space. Such a weapon may be aimed at destroying large-scale satellite constellations used for communications and reconnaissance. The elimination of these types of space systems could reduce the effectiveness of Ukraine's defense forces, which rely heavily on commercial satellite communications and imagery. It will also reduce the effectiveness of the U.S. military and its allies who are similarly dependent on these systems. Russian sword of Damocles. Russia's decision to detonate a nuclear weapon in space will almost certainly affect the Kremlin's satellites as well. But even if Russia does not use nuclear space weapons, Moscow may see its deployment as a new source of leverage, a sword of Damocles that can put enormous pressure on any other country's space systems. Moscow and Washington have tested anti-satellite weapons since the Cold War, but if Russia were to deploy nuclear weapons in space to attack other satellites, such a proposition would be an unprecedented development and a clear violation of the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. For the Kremlin, however, the costs of a breach may outweigh the benefits. The anti-satellite weapons that Moscow has demonstrated are not capable of effectively destroying large-scale satellite constellations owned and operated by private companies. However, a nuclear anti-satellite weapon can destroy a large number of these satellites at once. If Russian officials decide to deploy this capability, Washington has no option to stop them. By giving a like and subscribing the channel, you are helping an independent analytical media to continue its journey. Moscow and Washington have a lot of experience in developing anti-satellite weapons. During the Cold War, Moscow considered its non-nuclear and anti-satellite weapons sufficient to destroy key U.S. satellites. But in the post-Cold War era, the emergence of much larger satellite constellations likely rendered these non-nuclear anti-satellite weapons obsolete. Anti-satellite weapons appeared shortly after the dawn of the space age. Just 2 years after the Soviet launch of Sputnik, in 1957, the United States tested an anti-satellite weapon that could use a nuclear warhead to destroy its target. But thanks to the Eisenhower administration's restrained approach to space weapons, the weapon never became part of the U.S. arsenal. Before the advent of more accurate missiles, a nuclear warhead was required to destroy satellites in orbit, and high-altitude nuclear explosions showed that radiation in space was no different in terms of which objects it affected. Back to the era of competition in space. In the early 1960s, U.S. policymakers feared that the Soviet Union would send nuclear weapons into space in the form of an orbital bombardment system, that is, launch another nuclear weapon en route south over Antarctica to prevent an initial U.S. strike. United to prevent, the Kennedy administration responded to Moscow's action in 1963 by deploying nuclear-tipped missiles at Johnson Island in the Pacific Ocean. But U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War strained defense budgets, and officials worried that radiation from anti-satellite nuclear weapons would destroy U.S. and Allied satellites. As a result, Program 437, the project's name, was scrapped in 1975. High-altitude nuclear tests, Program 437, and orbital bombardment systems all emphasize that the line between nuclear weapons and space weapons is blurred. Fears of nuclear weapons in space were reduced, however, with the signing of the Outer Space Treaty in 1967, in which the United States, the Soviet Union, and other signatories pledged to use space for peaceful purposes and to ban nuclear weapons. Do not place in orbit or in the sky. But this treaty was also ambiguous. This treaty did not prohibit the deployment of nuclear satellites. It also did not blacklist non-nuclear space weapons, such as ground-based anti-satellite missiles designed to destroy space systems. Given that a number of technologies, including missile defense interceptors, could attack satellites, there was little agreement on how to even define what a space weapon was. This lack of consensus continues to this day. Ambiguities became a problem as soon as the treaty was signed. In late 1967, reports surfaced that Moscow was testing such a system, prompting then-President John F. Kennedy to deploy nuclear anti-satellite weapons in the Pacific. The U.S. government publicly stated that this new Soviet capability did not violate the Outer Space Treaty. However, senior officials confidentially considered such an approach offensive. They chose not to confront the Kremlin, in large part because these orbital nuclear weapons were less accurate than traditional ballistic missiles.